I went to visit my grandparents for the summer. They own a lake house up north. It's a very small community of retired folks, so it's very quiet up there. Because I was staying there for most of the summer, I invited my friend Peyton to go with me. My grandparents didn't mind the company as well. It was about a 2-hour and 45-minute drive up there. We stopped once to fill up gas and another time for some coffees. We had almost reached the shopping strip near the town. I looked out the window as I told Peyton to slow down the car. It was like an outdoor shopping mall. It looked kind of like those Hallmark movies, except without snow. The area was very clean, not even one piece of litter on the ground. There weren't very many people outside, which is understandable since it was an elderly community. Unless they were expecting guests or doing groceries, there was not much to do other than stay indoors. There was a steep hill that we had to drive up until we reached an intersection. I told Peyton to signal left on Main Street and Jewel. Then 2 streets down, turn right onto Melody Drive would be my grandparents' house. We turned into the driveway and got out of the car. Although it was still sunny, it was also lightly raining. I helped unload the car and then ran up to the front door and rang the bell. It was about 2 minutes until my grandfather answered the door. He greeted me with a hug and kiss, and then offered to help carry the stuff inside. The house was absolutely beautiful. It had a lot of windows for natural light, and everything was open concept. Right next to the kitchen was a glass door that led out to a sunroom. It had couches and a desk, a huge bookcase, and lots of green plants as it overlooked the lake. There was also a house next to us, and it had a dock with a mini speedboat. What a gorgeous view, and I know most of my summer I would spend hanging out with Peyton in the cozy room. We'd watch movies and jam to music, maybe do some reading. My grandma entered the sunroom with her arms out and gave me a hug and kiss. She also hugged and kissed Peyton too, and asked how her family was. My grandparents knew Peyton since she was 2 years old. They used to live not too far from my parents, but moved up here shortly after retirement. They wanted to switch from the busy city life and noise. My grandma asked me what was up with all the grocery bags. I told her since we were staying for a whole month, we couldn't expect her and Grandpa to also supply the snacks, but my grandma was a bit annoyed and told me that was nonsense, and we were still kids in her eyes. She would then call my mom later and give her an earful of how careless she was to let us leave with bags of food. My grandma said she would go fix us a nice meal to eat while my grandpa went to grab some flowers from the garden to set the table. Peyton and I took our things from the main floor to the second. There were 4 rooms up there. One was my grandparents' down the hall at the end, and 3 were unoccupied but still had beds. 2 bedrooms shared a bathroom, and another bedroom was across from us. Peyton and I took the adjoining rooms that had the lake view. We got settled with our things and then went downstairs where my grandma had already set the table with a rhubarb pie, baguette and butter, sausage links, homemade fries, Cobb salad, and lemonade. Everything was so good. Peyton and I offered to do the dishes after lunch, but my grandma was not having it. She told us to leave the kitchen and bother Grandpa instead. So we joined him in the living room where he opened an old family album and showed us pictures from when we all were much younger. There even was several with Peyton and I together, playing on the playground and eating ice cream with the melted drippings all over our arms. We later went up to our rooms to take a quick nap. It literally felt like 10 minutes when I woke up to my cell phone alarm going off, but in fact, 2 hours had gone by. I walked into Peyton's room, who was still sleeping, and tapped her on her shoulder to wake her up. She slowly opened her eyes and yawned. I told her we could see if Grandma needed any help prepping dinner, even though I knew what the answer was. We went downstairs and saw Grandma and Grandpa in the kitchen prepping veggies, and he was opening a bottle of red wine. There was some jazz music playing in the background. I insisted that my grandma let us do something, and she finally gave in and said Peyton could set the table and I could chop up some vegetables while she took the marinated chicken legs and baked them. After she took my veggies and made a quick stir fry. For a 73-year-old woman, she was very quick moving and had quite a bit of energy. My grandma told us to go upstairs and freshen up. All our towels and things needed for bathing were in the washroom cupboards upstairs. Peyton and I took turns showering, and we thought we could do facials and our nails after dinner. Food was once again delicious, and there was enough leftovers for lunch the next day, but I knew my grandma would still cook some new stuff for us to try. My grandpa said he and Grandma were tired and were off to go to shower and then go to sleep. If we needed anything, all we had to do was just wake him up. Peyton and I agreed and said we would just hang out in the sunroom and do some self-care stuff. My grandma thought that was such a fun idea and really liked the pink polish I was holding. She wanted me to paint her nails at some point while I was there. I promised I would. Peyton and I loved the sunroom. It was such a chill vibe about it, and at night we could see hundreds of twinkling lights around the area. They're probably the street lights, but it looked beautiful as it reflected off the water. Even the neighbor's house had their lights on. After painting our nails and washing off our face masks, we retreated to our rooms. Since we had already taken a nap earlier, it took me a bit longer to fall asleep. The next morning I woke up to the smell of pancakes and coffee. I looked at the clock. It was almost 9:30 in the morning. I brushed my teeth and looked into Peyton's room. She wasn't there. I went downstairs and I saw her sitting on the couch talking to Grandpa. Peyton looked at me and said she tried to wake me up a few times, but I told her to give me 5 minutes and I'd be down, but that was an hour ago. That definitely sounded like something I would do. We all ate breakfast and I could hear the thunder rumbling outside. It wasn't long until the sunlight from the house vanished and it got dark. The rain began to pour and it made a huge sound as it hit the lake. I helped clear the table and wash the dishes. Peyton wiped them and put them away. My grandparents walked over and sat in the living room watching a movie on the couch, while Peyton and I went into our favorite part of the house, the sunroom, and lounged on the couch on our phones. After a while, we thought it would be fun to put on a horror movie since the ambiance was perfectly ominous and gray. We decided to watch the 2022 version of the classic cult movie Hellraiser. We picked up a throw blanket each and lay out on the couch. Nearly halfway through the movie, my grandma walked in with a tray that had 2 cups of hot lavender tea and a bowl of freshly popped popcorn. I let my grandma know we were thankful but didn't want her to trouble herself over us. She smiled and said it was all right. Her and Grandpa said they would be stepping out for a bit to go next door. They were invited to dinner by the neighbors. My grandma asked if he would like to join them, since the Abagnales don't get much company often, on the count that the wife hasn't been herself for quite some time since her son, nearly 20 years earlier, went on a fishing trip with his dad and fell into the water and drowned. That's why Mr. Abagnale invites us over from time to time to give his wife a bit of a change and perhaps uplift her spirits. I told my grandma that it was such a tragic loss for Mrs. Abagnale. While we appreciated the invite, Peyton and I would rather stay home. My grandma said it was fine and that they wouldn't be too far. We could actually see them in their window next door from the sunroom. Shortly after my grandparents left, I took a hot shower and put a fuzzy robe on. In the fridge there were a couple of frozen pizzas and I put it in the oven. Peyton grabbed some snacks from our stash of junk food, and we continued the Hellraiser movie. It was around 10 p.m. Once the movie was done, Peyton offered to take care of the dishes while I stayed seated on the couch. I was super full, and I wondered what time my grandparents would be getting back. I looked out the window and saw the Abagnales' living room. My grandparents were on the sofa while Mr. Abagnale was sitting in his armchair. I saw Mrs. Abagnale enter the room with a tray of cups. I guess they had already had dinner and were getting ready for some tea. I went back to my phone and was scrolling through Instagram when Peyton walked into the room and asked me what the plans were next. Her gaze slowly shifted to the window and she had a worried look on her face. She asked me, "What's going on over there?" I looked out the window. I saw Mrs. Abagnale look like she was yelling at Mr. Abagnale. My grandparents were slowly rising from their seats. I had no idea what happened within minutes of Mrs. Abagnale bringing the tea into the room. Something was wrong. About 15 minutes later, my grandparents walked through the door. I rushed over to see if they were all right and what happened. My grandpa said Mrs. Abagnale had outbursts of anger sometimes. Usually it's because she hasn't taken her medication that day. Old people sometimes forget and need to be reminded. Luckily, Mr. Abagnale, at his age, had a sharp memory, and he went into the kitchen and got it for her. He and Grandma excused themselves and came home. I was relieved knowing that everything was okay. For a minute, Mrs. Abagnale looked like a crazy person in the window with her arms flailing around. My grandparents called it a night and retreated to their rooms. As usual, Peyton and I stayed up longer. We braided each other's hair and were playing the British game Snog, Marry, or Avoid. We were interrupted by a huge bang. The sound seemed to have come from the Abagnales' house. Peyton and I stood up and looked out the window. Most of the lights were on in the Abagnales' home. We saw Mrs. Abagnale on the top floor in what could have been her bedroom. She seemed to be holding something. I picked up my phone and used the photo setting to zoom the camera in like a pair of binoculars. I got a better look at the thing she was holding. It was a pistol. There was blood splattered all over her face and clothes. I screamed. Peyton asked me what the matter was. When I told her, she nearly fainted. Did Mrs. Abagnale just kill Mr. Abagnale? It had to be. My heart was beating fast. I don't think my grandparents heard the noise, otherwise they would have woken up and come right downstairs. I began pacing nervously back and forth. I needed a glass of water. I went into the kitchen when Peyton told me to get back into the sunroom. She saw the back porch light turn on, and then the door open. Mrs. Abagnale was dragging something heavy, and she was taking it towards the lake. I squinted my eyes, and then widened in shock. I realized it was Mr. Abagnale's body. For a brief moment it looked like she saw us through the window, but then we quickly fell onto the floor and tried to hide. Peyton said we should make sure the house is secure and call the police right away. Who knew how long it would take them to get up there? I called 911 and told the operator that I believed I witnessed a murder. They took all the information and advised me to stay inside and find coverage in case Mrs. Abagnale chooses to target more victims. We went upstairs and woke up my grandparents. We took them to a part of the house that was away from the windows. My grandparents were very confused and scared, but when I told them what happened, my grandma began wailing. I've never seen such a sweet lady cry like that before. My grandfather bowed his head down and shook it in disbelief. It was about 20 minutes later I saw the flashing lights from the cop cars at the Abagnales. I heard a knock at a front door and saw 2 officers standing outside. I let them in, and my grandma shortly after put on a pot of coffee while they asked us questions. It seriously felt like a horror movie. I could hear one of the cops on the walkie-talkies say that a body was recovered in the lake and that it was Mr. Abagnale's. Mrs. Abagnale was arrested and charged for second-degree murder. After that night, I didn't go much into the sunroom, and if I did, I would pull down the blinds as I didn't want to look in the direction of the Abagnale's house. During lunch one morning, my grandma told us that the town was talking about the murder quite a bit, since nothing of this sort has ever happened. And my grandfather said the local paper even printed about it, detailing that Mrs. Abagnale was seeing a psychologist for many years, but further notes revealed that she was on the verge of insanity. That was heartbreaking to hear. Maybe her intent wasn't to kill her husband, I thought. It was probably the sickness of her mind that caused it. Plus, living up here all alone without frequent visitors and suffering from her own loss could have just set her off the edge. For the last week at my grandparents', I made sure to call the security service and had some features installed in the home, like sensors and metal bars, just for that extra safety. It was a secluded area and anything could happen. I just wanted to make sure that my grandparents were all right because it was a long drive up just to check up on them frequently. I wish they hadn't moved out there. The day arrived where Peyton and I packed our things and got ready for the road. My grandma made sure she packed some baked goods for us and some to give to my parents. My grandpa slipped me a couple $100 and told me to come back soon. Peyton started the car and we drove off. It wasn't until a couple weeks later my grandma called me to tell me that Mrs. Abagnale was checked into a mental health facility, but then she took her own life. I didn't know what to say. It was horrible. The family of 3 all suffered gruesome ways to death. It seemed like it wasn't any of their times to go. How unfair life was. After I got off the phone with my grandma, I sat at my computer desk thinking that although there is serenity and beauty, which lies in the most underpopulated places, it also is the most lonesome parts, which could drive anyone mad, and I fully convinced myself that I would always stay in this city. Hey Scary Story fans, I hope you enjoyed these original stories written and narrated by me. If you have a story that is fiction or non-fiction and would like it shared in the next video, you can send your submissions to susannad.tv@gmail.com. In the meantime, sweet dreams!